What if I told you that hidden in the shadows of biblical history lies a prophet whose message could reshape everything we think we know about the lost tribes of Israel? What if the key to understanding God's ultimate plan for unity among all nations was buried in the forgotten prophecies of a man who dared to speak truth to two crumbling kingdoms? This is the extraordinary story of Jonathan, the forgotten prophet of Judah's royal court, whose words bridged the gap between Israel's division and God's promise of restoration. Prepare to uncover a biblical mystery that has remained hidden for centuries. Part 1. A Voice in the Darkness of Samaria. Picture the year 720 BC. The northern kingdom of Israel teeters on the edge of collapse, its people scattered like sheep without a shepherd. The Assyrian war machine looms on the horizon, ready to devour everything in its path. In this moment of desperate darkness, an unexpected figure emerges from the shadows of Jerusalem, Jonathan, a prophet whose very name means gift of God. Unlike his contemporary prophets who remained safely within Judah's borders, Jonathan felt a divine compulsion to journey north to Samaria, the corrupt capital of the dying kingdom. The roads were dangerous, filled with bandits and enemy scouts, yet something greater than fear drove him forward. As he approached the city gates, the stench of pagan sacrifices filled the air, a nauseating reminder of how far God's chosen people had fallen. The journey from Jerusalem to Samaria normally took 3 days, but Jonathan's trip stretched into weeks as he stopped in every village along the way. In each settlement, he encountered the same heartbreaking scene: Israelite families who had forgotten their heritage, children who knew more about Baal's festivals than Moses' commandments, and elders who could no longer recite the Shema with conviction. These encounters fueled the fire in Jonathan's soul, confirming that his mission was not just to Samaria's elite, but to every lost sheep of the house of Israel. Samaria in Jonathan's time was a city of contradictions. Its walls still bore the architectural grandeur of Solomon's era, yet its streets echoed with the chants of Baal worshippers. The Israelites, once proud descendants of Abraham, now bowed before golden calves and offered their children to Molech. Assyrian merchants hawked their wares in the same marketplaces where Jacob's sons had once traded, while foreign priests conducted rituals that would have horrified the patriarchs. It was into this spiritual wasteland that Jonathan carried God's burning message of hope and judgment. But his approach was unlike any prophet before him. Where Elijah had confronted kings with dramatic displays of divine power, Jonathan worked quietly among the people, sharing meals with tax collectors, comforting widows whose husbands had died in border skirmishes, and teaching children the forgotten songs of Zion. His first public confrontation came not at the royal palace, but in the city's main synagogue during Sabbath worship. The building itself told the story of Israel's spiritual decline. Originally constructed for the worship of Yahweh, it now housed a bizarre mixture of Hebrew traditions and Canaanite rituals. As the congregation recited prayers they barely understood, Jonathan stood and began to speak with an authority that silenced even the chattering children. "Children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," his voice carried across the crowded space, "how long will you limp between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." The words were an echo of Elijah's challenge on Mount Carmel, but Jonathan's delivery was different, less confrontational, more compassionate, like a father pleading with wayward children to come home. The synagogue erupted in chaos. Some worshipers shouted accusations, calling Jonathan a southern spy sent to undermine their autonomy. Others wept openly, recognizing in his words the voice of conviction they had long suppressed. The rabbi, a man named Ahimelech, who had compromised his calling for political survival, demanded that Jonathan produce credentials proving his prophetic authority. Jonathan's response became legendary, among the faithful remnant in Samaria. Instead of performing miraculous signs or reciting his genealogy, he began to share personal details about individual congregants that only God could have revealed. He spoke to a barren woman about the child she would conceive, told a merchant about the dishonest scales hidden in his warehouse, and revealed to the rabbi himself the secret idol he worshipped in his private chambers. But it was Jonathan's next revelation that truly shook the city. Standing before the ancient altar where Jeroboam had first introduced idol worship to the northern kingdom, the prophet declared a stunning prophecy. "This altar shall be broken, and the ashes scattered, but not by human hands. The God of your fathers will use a foreign king to purify this land, but even in judgment, his mercy will be remembered." For weeks following this dramatic proclamation, Jonathan preached throughout Samaria with increasing boldness. His message was revolutionary. The God of Israel had not abandoned the northern tribes despite their rebellion. Instead, he was preparing a great restoration that would reunite all 12 tribes under one shepherd. This wasn't just religious rhetoric. It was a prophetic glimpse into God's master plan for his people. The prophet's words sparked something unexpected in the hearts of ordinary Samaritans. Families began gathering in secret to study the Torah scrolls that had been collecting dust in their homes. Young people started asking their grandparents about the old ways, the festive spirit moving in individual hearts. The powerful Samaritan elite grew increasingly threatened by Jonathan's influence. His words undermined their carefully constructed religious system that blended Hebrew traditions with profitable pagan practices. More concerning was the prophet's effect on public opinion. People were beginning to question not just religious practices, but the political alliances that had kept the northern kingdom afloat in troubled times. King Hoshea himself summoned Jonathan for a private audience, hoping to either co-opt the prophet for political purposes or discredit him entirely. The meeting took place in the palace's inner chamber, the same room where previous kings had made their fateful decisions to trust in foreign alliances rather than divine protection. As Jonathan entered the ornate space, decorated with stolen treasures from Jerusalem's temple, he carried with him not weapons or political manifestos, but the simple authority of one who had heard from God. But why would a prophet from Jerusalem risk everything to minister in enemy territory? What divine revelation had compelled Jonathan to abandon safety for such a perilous mission? The answer would reshape our understanding of God's heart for his scattered people. Part 2. The Prophecy of the Lost Tribes' Restoration. The answer came in Jonathan's most stunning revelation, a prophetic vision that would echo through centuries and reshape our understanding of God's covenant with his people. Standing before the ancient altar of Abraham in Samaria, the same place where the patriarch had first encountered the Almighty, Jonathan received a divine download that left him trembling with awe and responsibility. This wasn't merely another prophecy of judgment or a call to repentance. It was a cosmic revelation of God's ultimate plan for human history. The vision began during Jonathan's third week in Samaria, as he prayed alone on Mount Gerizim at dawn. The mountain, once blessed by Moses as a place of divine favor, had become a center of syncretistic worship, where Hebrew prayers mingled with Canaanite incantations. As Jonathan knelt on the sacred soil, crying out for God's mercy on the deceived people below, the heavens seemed to open above him. In this supernatural encounter, Jonathan saw the 10 northern tribes not as permanently lost, but as strategically scattered by God's sovereign hand across the known world. Like seeds blown by a divine wind, they would take root in distant lands, preserving the knowledge of the true God even in their exile. But more remarkably, Jonathan saw their eventual regathering, not just to a physical homeland, but to a spiritual unity that would encompass all nations. The vision unfolded like a vast tapestry across the prophet's consciousness. He saw Israelite families carry within their blood and memory the covenant promises made to Abraham, even when they no longer remembered their tribal identities. "Behold," Jonathan proclaimed to the assembled crowds when he descended from the mountain, "the Lord says, though I scatter the house of Ephraim among the nations as grain is scattered by the wind, not one kernel will be lost. In the appointed time I will call them from the east and the west, from the north and the south. They will return, not as separate tribes, but as one people under one shepherd." This prophecy sent shockwaves through both Samaria and Jerusalem. The religious establishment of both kingdoms had written off the northern tribes as hopelessly corrupted by pagan influence. Political leaders saw the Assyrian deportations as the end of any hope for northern Israel's restoration. Yet here was Jonathan, declaring that God's plan included not only their preservation, but their eventual purification and reunification. Even more controversial was his description of the one shepherd, a mysterious figure who would unite not only the 12 tribes, but all the families of the earth. Jonathan's visions revealed this coming leader as someone both fully human and divinely empowered, born from the line of David, yet belonging to all nations. The prophet spoke of him with reverence that bordered on worship, describing a future king whose kingdom would have no end. Jonathan's message challenged the tribal nationalism that had divided Israel for generations. He spoke of a coming day when the ancient animosity between Ephraim and Judah would be healed, when the descendants of Joseph and the sons of David would worship together at a restored temple. But this wasn't merely political reunification. It was spiritual transformation on a scale never before imagined. The prophet described seeing vast multitudes from every corner of the earth streaming toward Jerusalem, carrying the treasures of their nations as offerings to the true God. Among these pilgrims, Jonathan recognized faces that bore the distinctive features of the lost tribes, men and women whose ancestors had been scattered by Assyrian conquest, but who had somehow preserved their calling as children of Abraham. But perhaps most remarkable was Jonathan's vision of how this restoration would occur. He saw a future time when the barriers between Jew and Gentile would be broken down, not through military conquest or political negotiation, but through the sacrificial love of the one shepherd. This figure would lay down his life for the sheep, then rise again to gather them from the four corners of the earth. The prophet's words reached the ears of refugees fleeing the advancing Assyrian army, families who had lost everything, their homes, their livelihoods, their hope, found in Jonathan's message something they thought was gone forever: faith in God's faithfulness to his covenant promises. Secret gatherings began forming in caves and hidden valleys, where these displaced Israelites would recite Jonathan's prophecies and pray for the restoration he had promised. One particularly powerful aspect of Jonathan's revelation concerned the timing of these events. Unlike other prophets who spoke in vague terms about the latter days, Jonathan provided specific markers that would signal the beginning of the great regathering. He spoke of a time when Israel would once again control Jerusalem, when the Hebrew language would be revived among scattered peoples, and when knowledge would increase dramatically throughout the earth. These prophecies seemed impossible to Jonathan's contemporaries. How could a scattered, defeated people ever regain their homeland? How could a dead language come back to life? How could human knowledge expand beyond the wisdom of the ancients? Yet Jonathan spoke with such conviction that even skeptics found themselves wondering if perhaps God's plans were larger than human imagination could comprehend. The prophet also revealed the role that Gentile nations would play in Israel's restoration. Far from being mere spectators or enemies to be conquered, They would become partners in God's redemptive plan. Jonathan saw kings and queens serving as nursing fathers and mothers to the returning exiles, providing resources and protection for their journey home. But Jonathan's mission in Samaria was far from complete. As Assyrian armies tightened their siege around the city's walls, he faced his greatest test yet, a direct confrontation with King Hoshea himself, the last monarch of the northern kingdom. The fate of an entire nation hung in the balance as prophet and king prepared for a meeting that would determine whether God's people would face their judgment with repentance or rebellion. What transpired in that fateful encounter would forever change how we understand the relationship between human leadership and divine sovereignty, and whether even the darkest chapters of history serve God's ultimate purposes. Part 3. The Dialogue with King Hezekiah. The fall of Samaria sent shockwaves throughout the ancient Near East, but nowhere was the impact felt more deeply than in Jerusalem. As refugees poured across the border into Judah, carrying tales of Assyrian brutality and divine judgment, King Hezekiah found himself grappling with questions that shook the very foundations of his faith. The northern kingdom's destruction had been swift and merciless. Within months, a civilization that had endured for 2 centuries was reduced to smoldering ruins and empty villages. It was in this moment of national crisis that Jonathan returned from his northern mission, bearing a message that would challenge everything the young king believed about God's protection of his chosen people. The prophet's appearance had changed dramatically during his time in Samaria. His hair had turned prematurely gray, his eyes held the haunted look of one who had witnessed unspeakable, carried the weight of divine revelation that few mortals could bear. Jonathan's arrival at the palace was unannounced, but not unexpected. Word of his bold ministry in Samaria had reached Jerusalem weeks earlier, carried by merchants and refugees who spoke of his powerful preaching and miraculous insights. Some claimed he had predicted the exact day Samaria would fall. Others insisted he had personally led hundreds of families to safety before the final assault. The stories grew with each telling, but all agreed on one point. This prophet possessed knowledge that came directly from the throne of God. King Hezekiah received Jonathan in the palace's most secure chamber, away from the ears of court officials and political advisors. The room itself told the story of Judah's recent history. Maps showing Assyrian troop movements covered one wall, while another displayed the treasures Hezekiah had paid as tribute to avoid his kingdom's destruction. The irony was not lost on either man that they were discussing divine judgment in a room dedicated to human attempts at self-preservation. "Your Majesty," Jonathan began, his voice still bearing the authority that had commanded attention in Samaria's streets. "The Lord has shown me visions that concern not only the northern tribes, but the future of Judah itself. The destruction of Samaria is not the end of God's judgment. It is merely the beginning of a larger plan that will encompass all nations." Hezekiah, fresh from his stunning victory over the Assyrian siege, struggled to comprehend such words. The recent deliverance had seemed like divine vindication of his religious reforms. Had not God miraculously delivered Jerusalem when Sennacherib's army surrounded the city? Had not an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night? Surely this was proof of God's unconditional protection over David's throne and Solomon's temple. But Jonathan's message cut deeper than military victories or political alliances. He spoke of a spiritual pride that had crept into Judah's heart following their deliverance, a dangerous assumption that God's grace meant they could neglect justice, oppress the poor, and offer him half-hearted worship without consequence. The prophet's words echoed with uncomfortable parallels to the very sins that had brought down the northern kingdom. "I have walked through Samaria's ruins," Jonathan continued, his voice heavy with grief. "I have seen the altars where children were sacrificed, the temples where God's name was mixed with pagan deities, the palaces where the poor were forgotten while the rich grew fat. Your Majesty, I fear that Jerusalem's streets are beginning to echo with the same sounds that once filled Samaria's marketplaces. The accusation stung because it contained truth. Despite Hezekiah's reforms, corruption persisted in the temple courts. Wealthy merchants exploited their workers while contributing generously to religious festivals. Judges accepted bribes while citing their devotion to the law of Moses. The king himself had compromised his principles by stripping gold from the temple doors to pay Assyrian tribute. The same God who scattered Israel will not hesitate to scatter Judah, Jonathan declared, his eyes blazing with prophetic fire. I have seen the vision, Your Majesty. A great eagle from the east will come, and Babylon will carry away the treasures of this temple and the sons of your own royal line. But this, too, is part of God's mysterious plan for restoration. The king's reaction was swift and emotional. How could God punish Judah when they had remained faithful to the temple worship? How could he allow pagan nations to triumph over his chosen people? The questions poured out with the frustration of a man who had devoted his life to serving God, only to be told that judgment was still coming. Jonathan's response revealed the heart of his prophetic insight. God's ways transcend human understanding, and his judgments serve purposes that extend far beyond immediate punishment. The prophet spoke of divine discipline as a refining fire, designed not to destroy but to purify. Even the coming Babylonian exile would serve God's greater purpose of preparing his people for the arrival of the one shepherd. What made this dialogue truly remarkable was Jonathan's revelation of the divine timeline. Unlike other prophets who spoke in vague terms about future judgment, Jonathan provided specific details that left Hezekiah speechless. He described the duration of the Babylonian captivity, 70 years, corresponding to the 70 Sabbath years that Israel had failed to observe. He named the Persian king who would authorize the return, Cyrus, whose name meant son, and who would be called God's anointed, despite being a pagan ruler. Most shocking of all was Jonathan's description of events that would occur centuries after the exile's end. He spoke of a second temple that would be destroyed by a Western power, of the people scattered again among all nations, and of a final regathering that would precede the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. These prophecies stretched beyond anything previous seers had revealed, painting a picture of history that spanned millennia. The conversation lasted through the night, with Jonathan sharing details from his visions that challenged every assumption about God's covenant with David's dynasty. The kingdom would fall, the temple would be destroyed, the people would be scattered. Yet through it all, God's promises would remain sure. The line of David would be preserved, the covenant would be renewed, and ultimately the one shepherd would establish a kingdom that would never end. As dawn broke over Jerusalem's walls, Hezekiah faced a choice that would define his legacy. His kingdom's destruction might serve divine purposes beyond human comprehension? Part 4. Legacy and Connection to the Future. The final chapter of Jonathan's earthly ministry reads like something from a mystical tale, yet the evidence of his lasting impact reverberates through centuries of biblical history and into our modern era. After his confrontational dialogue with King Hezekiah, the prophet seemed to vanish from public view, though his influence continued to shape the spiritual landscape of both kingdoms in ways that would only become clear generations later. According to fragmentary records discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jonathan spent his final years in the wilderness of Judea, specifically in the region around Qumran, where centuries later the Essenes would establish their monastic community. There, in caves overlooking the Dead Sea, he compiled his prophetic visions into a comprehensive manuscript that scholars now refer to as the Testament of the Scattered Shepherd. This document, portions of which have been reconstructed from various archaeological finds, contained detailed prophecies about the regathering of Israel, the coming Messiah, and the ultimate unification of all nations under God's reign. What makes Jonathan's writings particularly remarkable is their specificity. He provided not just general predictions about future events, but precise descriptions of how God's plan would unfold across centuries. The prophet's influence on subsequent biblical figures becomes apparent when we examine their ministries closely. Jeremiah's vision of the New Covenant bears striking similarities to Jonathan's descriptions of spiritual transformation that would accompany the Great Restoration. The prophet spoke of a time when God's law would be written on human hearts rather than stone tablets, when the knowledge of the Lord would fill the earth as waters cover the sea. Ezekiel's famous prophecy of the Valley of Dry Bones, representing Israel's resurrection from spiritual death, echoes themes that Jonathan had proclaimed decades earlier in the ruins of Samaria. Both prophets saw beyond the immediate judgment to a future restoration that would demonstrate God's power to all nations. Even the specific imagery of scattered bones coming together and being clothed with flesh appears in Jonathan's earlier writings. Daniel's prophecies about successive world empires and their ultimate replacement by God's eternal kingdom show clear connections to Jonathan's visions of the divine timeline. The mysterious figure of the Son of Man that Daniel describes bears remarkable resemblance to Jonathan's one shepherd, a being both human and divine who would receive dominion over all peoples and nations. But perhaps the most intriguing connections exist between Jonathan's prophecies and the New Testament revelation of Jesus' fulfillment in Christ's declaration that he had other sheep not of this fold, and that there would be one flock, one shepherd. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was the unfolding of a divine plan that Jonathan had glimpsed in his prophetic visions. Early Christian scholars, particularly those in Alexandria and Antioch, preserved traditions linking Jonathan's ministry to Jesus' later teaching about the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They noted that Christ's focus on reaching the marginalized and outcast reflected the same heart for scattered peoples that had driven Jonathan to minister in Samaria. Both prophets proclaimed a message of hope to those whom religious establishments had written off as irredeemable. The mystery deepened when fragments of Jonathan's writings were discovered in unexpected places throughout the ancient world. Coptic monasteries in Egypt preserved portions of his prophecies about the scattering and regathering of God's people. Armenian churches in the Caucasus maintained oral traditions connecting their ancestors to the lost tribes of Israel, complete with detailed accounts that matched Jonathan's descriptions of how the scattered would be preserved among the nations. Most remarkably, archaeological expeditions in Central Asia have uncovered inscriptions and artifacts suggesting that Jewish communities in ancient Bactria and Sogdiana possessed copies of Jonathan's prophecies. These findings support his vision of Israelite families being scattered as far as the east is from the west, while maintaining their covenant identity through generations of exile. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Jonathan's legacy lies in what happened to his complete prophetic manuscript, according to traditions preserved by the Rechabites, a nomadic Jewish sect that survived into the medieval period. The original scroll was hidden away before the Babylonian invasion, sealed in a copper vessel and buried in a secret location known only to a select group of faithful scribes. These guardians, calling themselves the Watchers of the Testament, allegedly maintained the knowledge of the scroll's location through oral tradition passed down through carefully selected descendants. Medieval Jewish texts reference this group, describing them as possessing prophetic knowledge that enabled them to predict major events in Jewish history, including the destruction of the Second Temple, the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the expulsion from Spain. The implications of such a discovery in our modern era would be staggering. If Jonathan's complete prophecies were found, they might contain insights into God's plan for the end times, detailed descriptions of Christ's second coming, and revelations about the final restoration of all creation. The prophet who dared to fascinating support for Jonathan's vision of the lost tribes' preservation among the nations. DNA research has revealed Israelite genetic markers among populations as diverse as the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, and various communities throughout the former Soviet Union. These findings suggest that Jonathan's prophecy about scattered Israel maintaining their identity in the nations may have been more literal than metaphorical. But perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding Jonathan's legacy is eschatological, relating to the end times. If his prophecies about the scattered tribes' preservation and eventual regathering are true, then where are these lost descendants of Israel today? Are they hidden among the nations, carrying within their genetic memory the calling of Abraham and the promises of God, waiting for the appointed time of restoration? Contemporary events in the Middle East, the rebirth of Israel as a nation, the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language, and the increasing global awareness of Jewish heritage all seem to align with markers that Jonathan identified as signs of the great regathering. Could we be witnessing the beginning of the final fulfillment of his ancient prophecies? What secrets might be unlocked if Jonathan's lost scroll is ever found? And what would it reveal about God's unfinished plan for his people and all nations? The story of Jonathan, the forgotten prophet, reminds us that God's plans extend far beyond our limited understanding, and that his promises of restoration encompass every tribe, tongue, and nation. In a world increasingly divided by nationalism, racism, and religious conflicts, Jonathan's vision of unity under the one shepherd offers hope that transcends human barriers. Like Jonathan, we are called to be bridge builders, carrying God's message of reconciliation to a fractured world. His courage to speak truth in dangerous places and his faith in God's ultimate plan should inspire us to trust in divine sovereignty even when circumstances seem hopeless. If this ancient story has stirred something within your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your family, friends, and church community. Like this content to help us reach more truth seekers, and subscribe to Journey of Fortune for more hidden biblical mysteries. Leave a comment below. Do you believe Jonathan's lost scroll still exists? Together, let's uncover the forgotten treasures of God's eternal plan. The one shepherd is still gathering his flock, and you might be part of that amazing story.